So here's the question. Should we watch violent media? Let's take a look at that.
You are watching the Beyond Sunday podcast.
So we have a lot of violence around us all the time, from TV to movies, music, and video games. And I know there are a lot of thoughts about whether there is a correlation between violent media and actual violence. Some will argue a direct cause and effect, while others will say there's no connection at all. There's a lot of arguments on both sides, and I don't plan to argue either of these points, actually. I have my own thoughts and my own personal experiences, but I actually want to turn to what Scripture can tell us about this subject. Now, again, as we often say, to be fair, the Bible doesn't say anything directly about violent media. TV, radio, and video games didn't exist when Scripture was written. The Bible does have a good bit to say, though, about violence as well as our thoughts, the things we're thinking about and the things we put into our mind. So as we look at violence in general, we see this. First, in Proverbs 3:31, do not envy a man of violence and do not choose any of his ways. King Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived, said not to look favorably on violent people. We shouldn't approve of what they do or emulate the way they live. We actually do this when we watch violent content. We are showing approval. As we play violent games, we are again emulating or acting out the way that a violent person lives. In Psalm 11, David shares that the Lord hates those that love violence. God takes violence very seriously. We see violence frequently in Scripture, but God is saying that if we enjoy violence or seek after it, that is something that He cannot bear. The Apostle Peter warns us not to repay any wrong with further wrong. He is saying that even if we experience violence, not to return it to someone else. So no retribution there. We do see this frequently in media, especially video games. Someone begins to attack you, you may be tempted to target them to try and get some measure of revenge digitally, if you will. The Apostle Paul lists outbursts of anger among the deeds of the flesh. These are things opposed to the Spirit of God, directly opposed to it. So I think we can see overall that violence isn't something God takes lightly. But if we aren't doing it and only watching it, does it matter? Well, the Bible gives us some great wisdom on how we should live our lives and the things we should focus on. The Apostle Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 10:15 that we should knock down anything that comes up against God's truth, and we should take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. We should endeavor to have our thoughts conform to what God's thoughts are, to have a better alignment with the way He thinks about things. Again, Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 4 that we should think and dwell on things that are true, honorable, good, and praiseworthy. This sounds like we are called to think on greater things that immerse ourselves than those things that we would just immerse ourselves in, like violent imagery and things. David tells us in Psalm 101, verse 3, that he will not set his eyes on such worthless things and won't let them get a grip on him. Paul again says in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, that we are not to be conformed to this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. So don't think on the things that are normal and common in the world, Paul would say. Renew your mind with God's truth instead. So it's kind of a different subject matter we're supposed to think about. Our hearts and minds are the battlefield, and we store things of violence, anything that's opposed to God, and they will take root within us. So as we receive those, we can store those things up. And as Jesus himself said in Mark 7, from within, out of the heart of men proceed evil thoughts. It's from inside of us, those things we've stored up, that things come. The Lord was greatly concerned, not just with our outward actions, but with what we stored up within our hearts. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm an action movie fan myself, so this is a challenging question for me. But if I'm honest with myself, God was calling us to something more. We weren't called to flow along with the world. We are called to be different, to be transformed, and follow His ways. And that's something I think we have to consider and invite God to show us how these things have impacted our lives. But for now, that's what I know.
This has been another episode of the Beyond Sunday podcast. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe.